One of the foundational debates in public administration, political science, and basically anything to do with government or organizational management is one of flexibility versus consistency. Because it's very hard to have one without the other. It's hard to empower bureaucrats or workers or judges or whoever to make their own decisions, but also maintain a consistent outcome. And depending on the era, depending on the issues, governments tend to go more one way or another. So maybe just to give a couple examples of this, because it can be a bit confusing. So this is an issue that you often come up with in the judicial system, specifically with regards to how much leeway should judges have over sentencing. So there's arguments to be made in both directions. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced because in the US at least you had a scenario where judges tended to see crime as a mental illness or as a social issue rather than like an actual crime, and they tended to put rehabilitation or the good of the criminal above the good of society. So there were people who were getting, I don't know, 6 months for a murder, something maybe not that extreme, but they were getting very minor punishments for very severe crimes. And you had criminals who kept going back out onto the streets. So the government opted to take away that flexibility, and they implemented minimum sentencing to stop judges from being able to just let these people get off scot free. On the other hand, though, it's not all crimes are the same. The situations might really mitigate how responsible the person was or what their intention is. And some people would argue, no, it's good for the judge to be able to come up with it themselves. And some people have said, I'd rather be tried by a judge than a jury because a jury doesn't really understand how sentencing works. And they often give like unduly harsh sentences. So that's like an example of this. And this is true in kind of any bureaucratic organization. And we tend to really hate modern bureaucracy, and we tend to say like, why do I have to fill out 3 forms? Why do I have to get so many different approvals? Why can't you make an exception? Why is it so inflexible? And it's pretty easy to just say the people in question are just dicks. They don't want to help you. They're trying to deny you service, that kind of thing. But the truth is a little more complicated. I think what they're trying to get through is consistency. So they have a very specific set of forms, there's very specific criteria. The idea being anyone who applies to the program or sends in the application or whatever knows exactly what's required and whether they qualify or not. It's supposed to kind of theoretically at least be so set in stone that if the person's denied, they can make an appeal and they know how to make an appeal. And the idea is just anyone who the program's trying to target or that the application is there for should be able to get it, whereas the people who aren't able to get it, and they're aiming for this like 99% of the time. So the idea is to have this reliable system, and by taking personal judgment out of it, the idea is also to reduce things like corruption and bribery and things like that. So that's very much kind of the system we work on today. Where a lot of public programs are very inflexible, but there's a reason for this. It's not simply to be bureaucratic for the sake of bureaucratic. Then on the other hand, you have more flexibility. Like people just have more independent abilities to do things. So like local governments just have more discretionary spending. If someone comes to a local politician and they need something, they'll have like a stash of funds that they can just use for that purpose. They can look at individual cases and make exceptions, that sort of thing. And it's less devoted to that. But that's a lot more open to arbitrariness, to people who aren't supposed to getting something, and not getting a consistent result. So those are kind of the two ideals, I suppose you could say. And I kind of want to relate this back a bit to the medieval guild system, because the medieval guild system is, I think, what a lot of people, particularly in the light of kind of recent events, want to go back to, which was a much more, at least from my understanding, flexible system where everybody kind of knew everybody, and the guild would take care of its own members, but there wasn't necessarily like a bureaucratic process. Unfortunately, as with a lot of third positionist ideas, there's not very many modern examples of this because a lot of third positionist governments arose in the 20s or 30s and collapsed after World War II. So, if we're trying to look at something that was a bit longer term and existed during a period that wasn't a war or an emergency, we're kind of left with Francoist Spain, the Estada Nova in Brazil, Baathism, and Peronism in Argentina. And Peronism always really interests me because it's such kind of an amalgamous mishmash of different ideas, but also that it's probably the most robust third positionist ideology. It's been a major force in Argentine politics since the 1940s. And at least during Peron's first term, it did appear to offer kind of a third way between democracy and autocracy. Because Peron won the election, as far as we can tell, legitimately. A lot of people like to portray him as a dictator, and I guess in some ways he was, in terms of the amount of executive power he took, and there was some shutting down of opposition newspapers, but I don't think there was any real doubt that a majority of the population supported him. And until the end, he was, when economic crisis and stuff happened, he was overwhelmingly popular. He had, I believe, he was like the first legitimately really elected president in decades, and the first legitimately re-elected president of I think the 20th century, maybe like ever in Argentina. But yet, there's a lot of aspects of like mass political organizations, stuff like that, that kind of resemble fascistic governments, but it wasn't particularly oppressive in the same way. So it kind of gave us a time period where we were able, at least during Peron's first term, to look at how would some of these things work. How would a modern guild system work? How would a government that's more based on mass popular participation but isn't a totalitarian regime actually function? And that brings us to the Eva Peron Foundation, or the Foundation Eva Peron. So the Peron Foundation was started in the year 1948 by the wife of Juan Peron, Eva Peron, otherwise known as Evita. And it was very interesting because it was sort of a government department, sort of an arm of the justicialist or Peronist party, and sort of a private charity. And it was kind of unique, and I don't know if I can really think of anything to the same example of it. And it's kind of the ultimate example of social welfare being delivered in a very individualistic and flexible fashion. And it was, at least in part, as is Peronism in general, based on Catholic social teaching. It's important to keep in mind that social justice originally meant something very different. It was broadly a Catholic concept, and basically the idea was just viewing the inherent value of each individual human being and trying to build a society that respected that. And obviously that's been changed into all kinds of intersectionality, but broadly speaking, all social justice meant was a fair shake for the working class, that they would have rights and that they would participate in the wealth of the nation, which is more or less what it meant. And the Eva Peron Foundation and Peronism in general was generally had a pretty good relationship with the Catholic Church. Just a side note, the problem is Peron himself was anti-clericalist, which kind of was the thing that sunk his first term in office because his clashes with the church undermined what they generally supported, because the church hates communism, but it also hates like total free market capitalism. So this was kind of seen as a third way. But that was kind of the goal of the Eva Peron Foundation, was to provide something kind of completely different. So the beginnings are pretty interesting. So when Peron became president, um, just for the sake of this, Juan Peron I'm just referring to as Peron for short, and Eva Peron I'm calling Evita or Eva Peron. It's confusing because they both have the same last name, obviously. But when Peron was elected president, people started donating things to Evita. So it was sometimes money, it was sometimes food, like because the Peronism was very much based on support of the unions. CTG, which I believe is still the largest union by far in Argentina, was more or less a autonomous part, I guess you could almost say, of the Peronist apparatus. And so Evita and Juan had a lot of support from the unions, so the various workers started giving her stuff. So like the sugar workers would just show up and drop off a huge amount of sugar. The cheese workers would show up and drop off cheese, canned goods, money, that sort of thing. And Evita didn't really know what to do with any of it to start off with. So she literally had like I think I forget if it was the caretaker or just some random people who worked at the presidential palace, and they would just load up their truck at night and go out to the slums and just distribute the stuff to the poor. And this kind of just went on, and there was kind of an anecdote of when the sugar workers came, Evita just worked with them to like take these huge industrial bags of sugar and like wrap them in smaller packages to distribute to the poor. And this kind of eventually became Evita's passion. And she was like, I like doing this. I like being able to meet the people. I like being able to kind of do something a little more personal. I mean, that's kind of an idea in Catholicism and a lot of political, like in Vietnam, when Diem was trying to implement a Catholic political order, he called it personalism, was his party's ideology. So eventually, what wound up happening is the Argentine government created the Eva Peron Foundation. So the Eva Peron Foundation was described in the Authorization Act in the sole hands of its founder, who will possess the widest possible powers afforded by the state and constitution. The foundation's aims were to provide monetary assistance and scholarships to gifted children from impoverished backgrounds, build homes, schools, hospitals, and orphanages in underprivileged areas, and to contribute or collaborate by any possible means to the creation of works tending to satisfy the basic needs of life for the less privileged classes. So, that was kind of the basics of it, and it started off with a very small donation from the Argentine government. So some of the organization's funding would either come consistently from the Argentine government or they de facto get some grants from it. But what makes it interesting compared to a lot of social welfare systems was the majority of its funding didn't actually come from the Argentine government. So as I said, the Peronists were very close with the unions, and the unions would just kind of unconditionally supported Peron, and that was the large way he came to power, was on the back of labor support. So on a basic level, the unions supported Peron and his wife, so they just started donating to the foundation. I think at one point it was something like they would donate 2 or 3 work days worth of salary from the union funds. And I think they also encouraged, they'd have collections at workplaces, or it would be like throw something in the hat for the senorita or things like that. So they just kind of give donations in general, but if there was a labor negotiation coming or they needed something from the government, they'd often make a big donation to the fund. And Evita would intervene on their behalf with her husband or try to get them a better deal or something. So like some people might see this as kind of a form of corruption, that people are paying for access, but at the same time, keep in mind this is not government funds. This isn't coming out of tax revenue. And the government also issued a couple excise taxes, like it came out that the foundation receives a percentage of the taxes on lottery tickets, cinema tickets, gambling, stuff like that. So they got donations from that. Various members of the Peronist Party who were wealthy would give donations. A lot of major companies would also give donations. It's kind of part of greasing the wheels for government contracts and that sort of thing. And there are some stories that companies were pressured into donating. I think there was one where there's a big sweet manufacturer who refused to give them money, and they had one of their factories closed for a year or two because health inspectors showed up and shut it down. And I think this happened a couple times, but generally speaking, the overwhelming majority of it was voluntary. It was also kind of, once again, this kind of comes to the nature that it was very much on a case by case basis. So sometimes they would pay people for materials, sometimes they'd expect to be given them. It really kind of depended on the situation. Another kind of interesting thing about it, and we'll get into its actual work, but I'm just kind of talking about the financing, is after Peron was overthrown in a coup, the successor government set up a process where people could come forward with complaints if they felt they had been coerced into giving money. Now, obviously, the government that overthrew Juan Perón was anti Perón, so I don't think there was really any issues with going forward. I don't think there was necessarily a stigma, but only one person came forward and it wasn't ruled in their favor. And the only incidents of them taking from the oligarchy was there's a case where an inheritance, there was some major wealthy family that was trying to evade taxes in Switzerland. And when the money, what the back taxes were seized, the Congress voted to give most of it to the foundation. So I think it's interesting because you have an organization that's partially state funded, but mostly isn't. And it comes from largely willing donations from all over society. And it had widespread support from all over society. So, what did the Eva Peron Foundation actually do? How did it operate? So, if you've seen the musical Evita, or in particular the movie Evita, which is I really enjoy, excellent movie. I really like the music in it. The thing you have to keep in mind with that is it's a very cynical interpretation of it. And the kind of the general popular portrayal of the Eva Peron Foundation is sometimes that it's just a bunch of money was extorted by people and then they just threw it at poor people and most of it was wasted or wound up in Swiss bank accounts. And I'm sure like some money was misplaced, but all government ministries misplaced some money. How it basically functioned is the organization employed a large number of social workers, and the poor or whoever would go to the foundation, speak with a social worker. The social worker would assess their situation, and then they'd give them something that would suit their personal issue. So, like, as today, you normally just have the government gives you money, but like, there's an example where someone came to Avita and she said, I need a sewing machine, I need new tin plates for my roof, and I need dentures. And Evita kind of laughed at that and she's like, oh, no one's asked for dentures before. We'll have to add that to the list of things we provide. And in that case, in a couple days, they dropped off the plates, they dropped off the sewing machine, and they dropped off the dentures, and they gave her a couple other things. So what they were able to do is because you didn't have quite the same level of bureaucratic process. I mean, they did have bookkeeping, they did record where the money went, they kept accounts and everything, but it was very much individually based. So if someone was asking for help and their house wasn't that bad, they might send some workers to help them fix it up or provide them with some building materials, or they might build them a new house. They do things like electrify houses, build water purification or new wells and stuff like that. The goal was very much to create an aid program targeted to the needs of the individual worker or the individual family. And in a lot of ways, the focus is a lot of was providing a mass number of practical goods. So something that the organization provided to perhaps a large proportion of Argentina's poor was sewing machines. So a huge number of sewing machines, hundreds of thousands, were distributed. And that alone helped out a lot of people because it meant they didn't have to buy new clothes as much. They didn't necessarily have to take it to a tailor. Obviously, I'm sure it hurt some of the garment industry, but it allowed a lot of very poor people a lot of options that they wouldn't normally have. Even things like good quality cooking pots, they provided massive numbers of those. And once again, that's something that's very simple, but dramatically improves your life. If you have a good set of pots, you can cook better meals. And they would do things like that. Shoes were another one, clothing, like I said, electricity, building materials, all this stuff they could kind of individually provide. And it would dramatically improve the lives of the people, but it wouldn't necessarily just be cash grants. Sure, they gave people money, but they'd often do stuff like pay the rent for a couple of months or that sort of thing. So, like I said, it's a very different model of social welfare. And in some cases, what they do is they would remodel entire towns or entire city blocks and that sort of thing. And it kind of went beyond just kind of housing. One of the things Evita really wanted to do was improve the quality of healthcare in Argentina. So previously, nurses were extremely underpaid, overworked, and undertrained. So she wound up creating a model hospital, and I think it was Buenos Aires, where nurses were very well trained, they were well paid, they bought state of the art medical equipment from America, that sort of thing. And some people say, well, this was kind of an unnecessary expense, but it was as much about a gesture that poor people deserved access to quality medical care. That medical care wasn't just for the rich; it was also just it was kind of a basic right. It was something we live in a society; everyone should have access to that. And she set up a national nursing school that provided high quality uh, tuition free education for nurses. And the idea being, well, maybe in some of these backwater towns that aren't big enough to have a doctor, you could have a nurse there and they could provide basic community medical care. And like I said, these are all very practical things that would cross over a whole bunch of different ministries normally and would kind of be very like I said very difficult to carry out. And they like they also went even beyond that. Like one of the things they set up is they set up like parks and vacation locations. So they build cottages and like near lakes or on the sea or something to give workers a subsidized place to go and take a break. They sometimes buy people's houses or land for them. They had a national soccer league, so they encouraged every town in Argentina to form their own soccer club, and they paid for all the socks and shirts and stuff like that. And one of the things that was useful about the organization from a political perspective is Evita stamped her and Peron's face on everything, and Evita Peron's name, and often Peronist sayings. So all the soccer jerseys had Evita Peron Foundation on them, which once again is very good from a political perspective. And they had like a national tournament, and there was prizes like scholarships. Uh, the team that won, the organization bought land and built them their own clubhouse, stuff like that. But once again, most of this money wasn't coming from state funds; it was coming from donations. And well, I think a lot of it was to curry political favor. I think a lot of people saw what was happening and they were on board with it. It wasn't a kind of a humiliating charity thing. I think in general, Evita even said this is about social justice. It's not about um, it's not about charity. It's about helping the individual person. As kind of a side note, something I think is really funny with what Peron said is under Peronism, the only privileged class is children, which I think is pretty base, to be honest. So there was that aspects of the foundation. Maybe just a little bit about to kind of conclude how Evita herself ran it. So something she liked to do is she, and I think something people forget is that there's oftentimes multiple reasons people do things. Like because the foundation in part existed to promote Peron and Peronism and to tighten their control over the country, that doesn't mean Evita didn't like giving things. He didn't like taking care of people. If you're a smart person, you try to do things that are both profitable and enjoyable and contribute to the greater good. So while social workers could take care of everything, Evita liked to, I guess you could say, hold court, and they'd pick certain families or groups to come up and talk to her, and she'd basically talk to them. She'd tell them, "We'll get you what you want." and she gave them a. It's weird because they gave him like I think it was like a 20 or 50 peso note, which wasn't very much money, but it was enough for bus fare. Ironically enough, kind of a funny anecdote is she had like a pile of notes, and if she ran out of money, she asked like the bureaucrats and officials who attended her to put something in the pile, so they all stopped carrying money in their wallets before they'd start. And she was very big on doing that, and very big on like visiting lepers and people with syphilis, and like hugging them and giving stuff to the poor directly. She would often give more than what was expected, and a lot of people in Argentina like considered her to be a saint. A lot of people still do, but particularly back in the day, people would have icons to her, altars to her. And as I said, the Catholic Church was very much on board with this whole thing because this is kind of what they're talking about. This is people helping each other. This is a community organization. This isn't socialism. It's something kind of different. So I think the Eva Peron Foundation kind of shows us that there does exist alternatives to, I guess you could say, modern bureaucratic delivery. Now, Peronism at this time was kind of a flash in the pan, I guess. So I don't know if this would work today or what kind of society it would work in. We might just be too diverse and have too low social trust and social capital to make something like this work. But it is interesting, and it does show that like there are alternatives, and sometimes they work out pretty well. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. I know people like it when I do history videos. I figured I'd do something a bit different than